So it's my job to formally introduce the Admiral and give you a little bit of his background. He's known to some of us who've had the privilege of being mentored by him as faculty here or take classes from him. And normally I would just read his lengthy bio, lengthy and very impressive bio. That would keep us here for a good half hour at least, but suffice it to say he was the Deputy Director of the CIA, he was the head of the National Security Agency, 31 or 32 year career in the Navy.
Almost 31.
Almost 31, okay, career in the Navy. Then a second career in the business and technology sector here as the CEO of MCC, as a successful venture capitalist. Most importantly for our purposes, he is the Centennial Professor at the LBJ School and an esteemed teacher and mentor. But what I wanted to do to introduce him tonight is actually read a little excerpt from that noted scholar Bob Woodward's book, A History of the CIA. You know where this is going, History of the CIA, because this helps introduce our theme of Admiral Inman and Senator Goldwater. And this is, now if you know that if Bob Woodward wrote it, it's got to be true. So as a professor, I will neither confirm nor deny the veracity of any of these sources. But anyway, this is from Woodward's Veil, The Secret Wars of the CIA from 1981 to 1987. And the question in the scene I'm about to open here is President Reagan has been newly elected, and who is he going to pick as his CIA director? Senator Barry Goldwater was at the time the chairman of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence and had a very close relationship with Reagan going back at that point 20-some years. And also had some strong opinions on who President Reagan should pick. And so with that preface, I will pick up in the book here. There was a report that Casey would be the new, this is Bill Casey, there was a report that Casey would be the new CIA director. This had appeared in the newspapers. Senator Goldwater disagreed with the choice. He had his own candidate, Bobby, he told Quinn. It's got to be Bobby. Bobby was Admiral Bobby Ray Inman, who headed the National Security Agency for the preceding 4 years under Carter. Goldwater thought that Inman was an intelligence genius, a man who understood politics, science, and human nature. He was also a skilled congressional handholder. In 28 years of naval service, Inman had risen through the officer ranks to 3-star admiral, the only intelligence specialist to serve as executive assistant and senior aide to the vice chief of naval operations, a post normally reserved for officers who have held ship commands. He'd gone on to be the director of naval intelligence and the number 2 at the Pentagon's Defense Intelligence Agency before heading the NSA. Inman knew the intelligence business cold. He was the best source on everything from the latest spy satellite to the bureaucratic maneuvering required to get intelligence programs going. He had a fabulous memory. He is one of the few intelligence officials who would talk to reporters and get them to hold off on stories that compromised intelligence. He had nurtured all the important relationships in the Congress. Goldwater could not recall an instance in which Inman had failed to return a phone call or to track down an answer on the rare occasion when he didn't know it. It was easy for Goldwater to slip in to see President-elect Reagan and explain his unqualified enthusiasm for Inman. The most capable man in the field, Goldwater said, a man in a category by himself. Reagan listened, but he had his heart set on Casey. Goldwater banged the drum very hard, making it clear that the new administration would have a lock on the hill for intelligence matters if Inman were DCI, Director of Central Intelligence. Anyway, Reagan, and perhaps one of his few lapses, did pick Casey, and we won't go there. But Admiral, it's nice to hear from the pages of Bob Woodward what Senator Goldwater thought of you. Tell us.
If you read the preface to that book, Veil, Woodward says, where I was not a party to the conversation, I have tried to recreate it as I believe it probably occurred.
Well, I will also say, since this is an adult audience here, that there are some PG-13 passages in the book, might even are, including Goldwater's spewing epithets when he heard that Reagan did not pick Admiral Inman for CIA. But anyway, you have to buy the book to read those. So we don't use that kind of language here at the University of Texas. So Admiral, we heard there what, according to Bob Woodward, Senator Goldwater thought of you. What did you think of Senator Goldwater?
I really hadn't been aware of Senator Goldwater because I've been away from outside the continental U.S. for a great many years in my Navy career. And so he really came on my radar when he ran for president in '64. And the positions as articulated in the media and the Johnson campaign ads made him sound rigid, warrior, likely to get us into conflict in an era where you needed thoughtful consideration negotiations. So that was the impression created from '64. Fast forward, when I was in the vice chief's office as the EA, occasionally we would have constituency issues, including Senator Goldwater. I tracked for the vice chief every day how the Navy Department had done in its congressional relations. I knew who were problems, and I knew who took, rational answers. That's fine. Not me. Well, I want it, therefore you need to do it. Goldwater was always rational in the process and never pushed once a rational response had been given. So that began to temper a little bit my image of it. But really, flash forward to '74. I'd become the director of naval intelligence, and the Congress had started investigating the intelligence community for some real, some imagined abuses over the previous 25 years. Tough time. Senator Frank Church chaired the Senate one, Congressman Otis Pike the House. That's where I came to work very closely with Congress, and that's another whole story, separate from the Goldwater one. When those hearings were all over, the Senate, before the House, decided to create a permanent oversight committee to track what was going on inside the intelligence. It concluded there had not been enough oversight in the past. From my perspective, I saw it as a whole new opportunity for having congressional oversight. You couldn't explain to the public what you were doing in most cases because it was highly classified, particularly how you knew was sensitive. And if in fact you could, the Congress, elected by the public, as surrogate for the public, if you could have a structure where you could in fact talk freely, it was a good thing to do. Now, there was great resistance in the Pentagon throughout the intelligence community. Just at that point, an old Texan, George Mahon, who was chairman of the House Appropriations Committee, decided he wasn't going to be caught off ground not knowing what was going on. So he scheduled hearings before the House Appropriations Committee in the Capitol, those grand old spaces, on every highly classified program the intelligence community had. And I went with the Undersecretary of the Navy to brief everything we were doing underwater, underseas, never a leak. So that told me if you've got a chairman who will exercise discipline over the members and the staff, you can in fact share highly classified information. So just at that point, Senator Daniel Inouye of Hawaii, who had been a long-time chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee Subcommittee on Defense, which included intelligence. He had been designated to be the new first permanent chairman of the Intelligence Committee. So he surprised us by coming to the Pentagon to visit with a few of us. And a simple question: what do I have to do in putting together a committee to have you tell me what we need to know, so that I don't have to ask the right question to be able to get an answer? So I'm not bashful, spoke up and said, first, you've got to establish a security regime that provides great confidence that what we provide isn't going to be leaked to the media. We have enough trouble in the executive branch, much less adding the Congress. Second, to the degree it is possible, never take a vote on intelligence matters on party lines. Set out to, from the beginning, to say you've at least got one vote from the other side of the aisle if you're going to take it to a vote. He thought about all that and went much further than I expected. He went back, got approval of the majority leader, minority leader. The new committee is created. It is the only committee in the Congress where you have a chairman and a vice chairman. So it isn't a ranking minority by title of vice chairman. Second, all the staff reported to the chairman and the vice chairman. No individual member had their own staff member there. It was a designee they used, but they reported entirely to the staff director, Bill Miller, and Earl Eisenhower, and directly to the chairman and the vice chairman. Goldwater was the vice chairman. And it was apparent almost from the first meeting that he and Senator Noy had reached complete accord on this process. And so they treated everything as a team, which was pretty unusual to encounter. But it was, I think the real surprise was that Goldwater was willing to do that. I'll pause to let you get another question and I keep going.
Well, no, this brings up a great follow-on one, which is Goldwater is remembered in history for being this very conservative Republican, one of the leaders of the conservative revolution. And yet, anyway, my wife's home state senator, until he passed away just last year, was known as being a pretty liberal Democrat. So in the case of Goldwater, was he able to put aside partisan questions on some of these things and work across the aisle when it came to a national security matter?
Yeah. When he had very conservative views on fiscal matters. Mm-hmm. He also was very conservative on social issues, but he believed a true conservative. He was very direct. What went on in the bedroom was none of the government's business. What a woman did with her body was none of the government's business. And his view was that was the position of a true conservative. So social issues and all the rest of it, he absolutely, and there's stories we'll get to later, where he actually, against potential storm from the social conservatives in his party, went straight down the line. But on national security issues, he, without exception, okay, he always looked for where can you bring together a consensus. He wasn't reluctant to try to help shape that consensus and his views, but a very strong believer that, back to the old Arthur Vandenberg, politics stop at the water's edge.
So with the partisan climate in Washington today, and a lot of people being concerned about congressional dysfunctionality and things like that, what ways did you see Goldwater, whether it was the staff he hired, the relationships he built with other senators, how was he able to function and be a part of a functioning Senate?
Let me run through several stories, if I may, here, that sort of
stories.
gets the committee at work and how does it work. Committee had been established about 6 weeks when one of the Democratic senators, they were the majority, from Colorado, later much more famous for a boat called Monkey Business and things like that.
Senator Gary Hart, for those of you who don't know your 1980s history. So, okay.
Senator Hart wanted to do a publicity release on an arms control issue. So he sent for his intelligence designee to come help write this article, which was not a project of the committee. It was Senator Hart's office. That got reported back to staff directors. They went to see the chairman and the vice chairman, and Senator Noy fired the staffer. And Hart went running in and said, "You can't do that." And he said, "I just did." And that created a discipline that had been totally missing. It was sort of a visible execution in the process. We're 2 years along, and Senator Noy decided to step down. He thought he was going to set a precedent that you didn't stay as chairman. He didn't give up Appropriations Committee. They did 2 years unintentional. And the new designee was Senator Birch Bayh from Indiana. very liberal senator. Inouye was not liberal in any sense. So, great apprehension in the intelligence community. So I went to see Senator Goldwater to ask his advice. You know, there's a lot of concern in the intelligence community about this. He said, invite Senator Biden to breakfast at NSA and tell him how the community feels. Just very direct. So a little bit of guff talking that directly to the new chairman of the committee. But I told him basically he wasn't trusted. He was going to have to earn his credentials. He took it very well. He worked very well with, I described how working relationships had gone the two previous years. And so things really worked well until, this is now, we're 76 to 78, 78 to 80. And we get into the election cycle in 80. Senator Goldwater had gone off to have hip replacements. And Bai was in fight for his life, for his seat, which he lost in the process. The discipline of the staff disappeared. Suddenly, they were no longer there to tell the staffs they had to stay out of politics. So it was primarily very conservative Republicans, some names you will know, Angelo Codevilla and others, who got out and got deeply involved in politics. And that began to erode the confidence in the intelligence community that you could go, because there were some examples of things being leaked. It had never occurred before. I would put the Senate Select Committee's record for protection of classified information from 76 to the spring of 80 up against any other element of government. In fact, better than CIA's, where they did a lot of leaking in the process. Election's over, Republicans win the majority, and Senator Goldwater becomes the chairman of the committee. And he followed on the same tradition. The new vice chairman was Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York.
That's a formidable duo.
They really were. They turned out to be wonderful to work together with. I had already been able to establish a bit of a relationship with Senator Moynihan. But I learned very quickly not to go see them at 6 o'clock in the evening. They might shout back and forth at one another during the daytime, but at 6 o'clock they would retreat to the small private office down the basement of the Capitol that Senator Goldwater had earned by seniority at that point, and break out the bottles. And I couldn't begin to keep up with them. So I'd go see them at lunchtime.
There is the craft of intelligence right there, sort of, yeah. Learn when your partner is sober and not, so anyway.
Goldwater was as steady as the chairman as he had been in the vice chairman role. And Moynihan did well. So that relationship actually lasted for 4 years until there was a turnover in leadership. And then you go through a period where Pat Leahy's head of judiciary and Durenberger from Minnesota was chairman. As soon as there was a hearing, the two would be in a foot race to get in front of the cameras for the media. And so much of the hard work from the previous 8 years of really making oversight work. During that time frame, in that first 4 years, we got the FISA legislation, creating the FISA court. We got the Classified Information Procedures Act, which said if somebody is alleging they're going to reveal secrets if you try to prosecute them, judge had to decide in camera, was it relevant to the charges? And if not, couldn't be introduced. So you had successful prosecution of U.S. people who were doing espionage for other countries. That most famous one was an Army sergeant working for Noriega, Panama, who got off. That's what propelled our getting legislation. So it was a time where the process worked. Now, the hard part for me, the Woodward is a little off in his story. The first interaction, what when Governor Reagan lost the New Hampshire primary, he asked Bill Casey to be the chairman of his campaign.
This is the 1980 election.
1980 election.
Okay, yeah.
This is bringing New York in, get past the Rockefeller, Republicans and those. Casey had made his fortune writing books on how to avoid paying taxes. And so his general view was, if it's not explicitly prohibited by law, you can do it in the process. He'd been head of covert operations of OSS in Europe in World War II, a great time in his life. So in the exchange, when he joined the campaign, and this I know, all this is what Governor Reagan and President Reagan told me. He'd asked Casey, if we win, what job would you like to have? And he'd said, if I can't be Secretary of State, I'd like to be Director of Central Intelligence. Fast forward, November 80, the election, the results are coming in. It's clear that they won. And the governor turns to Casey and said, well, Bill, are you ready to be the DCI? And he says, if I can't be Secretary of State. They all laughed. An hour later, the phone rang. And it was Senator Goldwater calling to congratulate the president-elect, who had gotten into politics working in Goldwater's campaign in '64.
A time for choosing speech.
Yeah. And he exchanged pleasantries about it, and then the president-elect, Senator Goldwater said, I just have one favor to ask. I have the perfect candidate to be your Director of Central Intelligence. Bobby Inman, Vice Admiral. Of which the president-elect said, I told him, well, I met him, but I've already given the job to Bill Casey. There was a long silence because Goldwater and Casey hated one another from Republican Party politics. In '66, Casey ran for the House of Representatives with William Safire as his campaign manager and defeated the only Goldwater supporter in the New York delegation, who later came on to live in Austin. And then Casey lost in the general election to Tom Downing. So the animosities were deep.
So that goes back 14 years then. Okay, yeah.
Early. And from the very beginning, Goldwater then went to see the president-elect to pursue the case.
Mm-hmm. As we hear a little bit.
And that's the part that's in where the book picks up. But as the president-elect later told me, he said, you know, he marshaled everybody he could find. I got more pressure about you than any other single slot. So DeKalb suggested, well, why don't you put together a team? Casey said, Director, then please, Senators, about making Inman the deputy. And I turned him down. And I had, as they kept doing it, each stage of the game, I kept saying, sorry, not going to do it. Secretary of Defense to be Weinberger, listening to all this, offered me a job in the Pentagon, 4th star, and I asked him if he had all the defense intelligence. And I asked him if he'd checked with the Chairman of Joint Chiefs. He hadn't. He did. Came back and said, well, you're right. They don't want an active duty 4-star on the OSD staff. But would you retire and take a job as Assistant Secretary of Defense for Intelligence? And for a weekend, I thought that sounded pretty exciting until my wife said, are you crazy? So I said, okay, stick with retirement. So fast forward, the day after inauguration, Secretary says, President's calling. I thought it was Carter following on getting the hostages. It was the President. And he goes through all of this routine, the interaction with Senator Goldwater, the rest of the point in time, and then came the curveball. Well, Admiral, now we're in office, and speaking as your Commander-in-Chief, I need you, I want you to take the job as Bill Casey's deputy. And so under the circumstances, Mr. President, I'd be honored, but hopefully no more than 18 months, 2 years. He said, well, I guess that'll be okay. That wasn't on the cards. And he said, by the way, thank you for accepting, I'm going to nominate you for a 4th star. So that's how this ersatz OCS to 4-star came about. Well, what settles in? Goldwater doesn't want to deal with Casey, but he is the DCI. So every time Casey is going to appear before the committee, I am summoned to come along. It became a zoo because Casey naturally mumbled, but he made a real to-do of it to avoid having to answer questions directly. So they had to, he'd back up away from the microphone, and they eventually had this microphone that would bend and stretch way out to the process. Well, I got very uncomfortable with some of the answers. And if people would die, I have a tendency, if I'm not, I'll dumb my fingers or I'll pull up my socks. Well, in all the literature, it claims that the deal was worked out with Senator Goldwater, that I would tug on my socks when Casey was lying, and he should lay them down. It was a nervous affectation on my part. And was he in fact, yeah, he was stretching the truth or not telling all of the truth.
Yeah.
So it made for painful times. And we finally get to, I finally just was fed up over what I thought was violating the spirit of the findings on covert operations in Central America. Gave my letter that I was going to go on the 18-month notice. Sent it directly to the president with copies to Sec State, Sec Def, and National Security, and Casey. Great uproar. Month goes by, nothing has happened. So as I'm getting ready to go out to New York for an event, I tell the DCI that, you know, you better get working on a deputy, because on 1 July, I am gone. So he goes down to the White House to have a meeting, what to do about Inman resigning. And Jim Baker said,
He was
well,
the White House Chief of Staff at the time.
you better check with the chairman of the 2 committees. What are their views on this? Who do they have people they think we should look at? Casey said, I'll take care of that. And he calls on the phone. Doesn't go to see. Well, Congressman Bowen, Eddie Bowen, oh, sorry to hear that. No, I don't have any candidate. So, Goldwater was furious that I had not come to see to tell him I was going to go. Now, that's on a Monday. On Wednesday, Bob Woodward goes to interview Senator Goldwater on Iran, other activities unrelated to it.
Whatever Woodward was chasing after that week. Yeah. Okay.
Senator Goldwater didn't want to talk about that. All he wanted to talk about was, we're losing the Admiral. He's leaving. We're losing the Admiral. So Woodward goes zooming back down to the Post. They put out all points bulletin because total news everybody. So they spread out asking questions, all of the departments. Quickly gets up to the top. And they decide, we'll scoop the Post. So Casey goes roaring down to the White House. They have a very nice letter from the president accepting my request to retire and resignation as DDCI. And decide by scooping, they dropped the 2 letters on the White House press corps at 5:30 in the afternoon. You do not announce second level departures on a sudden news drop that hour. Instantly they're all pushed back. So it led every one of the evening news broadcast, and you know, great furor that followed out of it. But Senator, you know, again, he had great things to say publicly, but unfortunately, every time he praised me, he also had to stick a little dagger in the DCI. So it made for some tough times. I'm sorry I've rambled on.
No, this is, yeah.
There are several isolated stories back earlier that capture the man.
Yeah.
I had been director of NSA about 2 years, for the 5th of July, 77, so this must be 79. We had an employee who had just finished State Department's Foreign Service Institute language in a Central Asian language, the highest score ever scored, who went to Frank Kameny, a Washington lawyer who was head of the ACLU Gay Rights Division, and to inform us that first that he was gay and that he wanted to continue working. Well, up to that point in time, you did not.
In the late 70s, that was a very
All
different
the
issue.
way
Yeah.
through the far, because there have been so many cases of blackmail,
Yeah.
people along the way. Sat down with a lawyer, and he said, how are we going to lose this case? So he said, what are the government's valid interests? First, no blackmail. So he's got to tell every member of his family. Second, to the degree that you can avoid it, that he not publicly identify himself as an employee if he's taking place in demonstrations, gay pride, et al. Third, that there be no violation of state or local laws. So what he's doing in his own residence, the rest of it is not the government's business, back to Goldwater's line. But don't get out and get arrested in activity. And the fourth one, annual polygraph. One question. Have you been approached or contacted by anyone you think might be working for a foreign intelligence agency? They accepted all 4 terms, made the decision to retain his hire, told the Secretary of Defense, Dr. Brown supported it, but said you better tell the chairman of the committee's process. Did. Suddenly it became across the intelligence community, all the security types, crazy. There were flyers everywhere. NSA has solved its space problems. They've emptied their closets. It was pretty brutal. It got to the media. And one of the first people they went to interview was Senator Goldwater, who said, of course I know about the Admiral did exactly the right thing. That's the policy we ought to have. End of story. It was a one-day story at the time. I got lots of harassment about it later, still from the intelligence community. But that he was, in fact, a true conservative. But also he said, what is in the interest of the intelligence community and the government? And I found him uniformly supported. I'll stop rambling.
Well, there's a, thinking about Goldwater's legacy, and I speak here as a native Arizonan, so he was my home state senator. I still remember seeing my grandfather's Goldwater bumper sticker on his Cadillac back in the 70s, and come around election time, and remember shopping at the Goldwater department stores. That's how the family had made their money in Arizona, so it's a big name in Arizona. And of course, his run for president in 1964 was what really galvanized and catalyzed what became the conservative movement that later led to Reagan's election. But here we are on the 50th anniversary of the passage of the Civil Rights Act. We're going to, just in another 6-7 weeks, do a big commemoration of that here at the LBJ Library. And as is remembered, one of perhaps the less positive aspects of Goldwater's legacy was, as a candidate in 1964, he ran against the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
Doing it, as I understand it, on states' rights and federalism grounds. Where was he on race issues when you knew him? Did you think that there was any, to ask it directly, were there any racist feelings in his heart? Was this just more of what he saw as a principle to stand on a constitutional ground? How do we understand that?
Back in those years, I had no exposure.
Yeah.
And by the time I pick up in the late 70s, I never saw any race, gender, preference bias. One of the things I did was to promote a woman to be the first deputy to be the deputy director of NSA and the first woman to hold that rank anywhere. He was totally supportive of it in the process. I'm just trying to reflect back to see if I can find an instance where I watched, and Ed may have, Dean Dorn may have a more solid view here, but I saw promotions come through the Armed Services Committee where he was serving senior roles. And that's when we were finally beginning to promote some African Americans to flag rank general. And I never got even the slightest hint of opposition on his part. I didn't see any activism on his side to go promote it on the other side. My understanding from a long historical view back was his argument in '64 was that this should not be something the federal government should be doing, this should be a state's issue, which you still hear a lot of the conservatives say.
Another important part of Goldwater's legacy is the 1986 Goldwater-Nichols Act, which did a profound reorganization of the Department of Defense. Still is regarded today in national security circles as really one of the, next to the 1947 National Security Act, one of the most significant pieces of national security related legislation. What did you have any observations on Goldwater's role in pushing that through, how he dealt with some of the opposition from the service chiefs?
This is not part of the public record. I retired.
What's said in room 3.124 will stay in room 3.124.
I had retired in July '82. And I got a call from the Chief Naval Operations. They were enormously concerned about Goldwater-Nichols. And I was asked, would I go see Senator Goldwater and convey the Navy's concern? And they sort of armed me with all of the arguments that you were going to take the brightest people out of the operational lines and put them in the Joint Chiefs and the defense staff. And he listened politely and finished, and he said, I presume you were asked to come do this. And I said, yes, Senator, that's accurate. He said, well, you did well at representing us, but we're going to do what needs to be done. So, he was gentle with me from the long-time personal relationship side, but he was not moved by the Navy's argument of how this was really going to disrupt things by moving them off to the side. When he got a clear beat on what he thought ought to be done, he was not easily diverted. And I saw that there are things that are still classified, whether operations or the rest of it, where there's a specific instance where they're about to go fund some political activities and funding election candidates. And in this case, it's Daniel Patrick Moynihan who sort of unloaded, saying, you all know much less about politics than I do, and I wouldn't know who to choose, of which candidate to back. Would they be able to govern? Momentary silence, and Senator Goldwater says that he has my vote. And that ended it.
Let me ask one more question, a more general one related to your career in the intelligence community, and then after this we'll turn it over. I think our audience here might have some questions too. So over the years, you saw some real highs and lows, particularly some of the crises and challenges facing the community, the Church and Pike Committee hearings in the 70s, Iran-Contra in the late 80s. Give us some context for the ongoing turmoil with the still unfolding Snowden revelations today. How, in the long history of the intelligence community in the U.S., how bad is this, and where do we go from here?
Let me put again in context that in the Church and Pike Committee hearings, a major focus was on spying on U.S. citizens. And there had been, the Nixon White House was absolutely persuaded that the anti-Vietnam organization riots were funded by the Soviets through Cuba. They persuaded themselves of it, they could not be dissuaded. And that's the break-in at the Watergate, was to find the evidence to, nail down that case. So there was a paranoia about funds that flowed out to support other activities. And Tom Charles Houston, on the Nixon staff, had put together a plan working with the leaders of the intelligence community to begin conducting surveillance of all the identifiable anti-Vietnam War leaders. The plan never went into effect because J. Edgar Hoover objected to it. He killed it. He killed it because he thought he was getting other people into his turf. It wasn't from a U.S. citizen. But we're not going to have all
This
those
was
other...
not Hoover, that principal defender of civil liberties, okay.
No, we weren't going to have all those other intelligence agencies getting into my business. So it never took place. Nonetheless, it came out in the hearings. For General Allen, my predecessor, open hearings, laying out the plan. Did your predecessor agree to this? Well, Geiler had in fact signed on, as it was approved by the president, they would try to implement it. So when I took over as the DCI, everywhere I went out to make any kind of an action, first question was, are you spying on us? The general assumption, if NSA was collecting or involved, they must be maintaining files on U.S. citizens. Separately, the whole issue of public cryptography was just beginning. And the senior engineer at NSA on the 5th of July, 77, in frustration that General Allen and everyone wrote a letter to the IEEE saying, your research in cryptographic activities by you and your members is a violation of law, U.S. Code 8, etc. So, firestorm on the process. So I had to, how do you deal with public perceptions that you're engaged in illegal activities in the process? Multi-front approach. Really elevate our interaction with the committees and oversight. Anything we thought was a problem, take it to them. I was very uncomfortable with warrants to collect information inside the U.S. on foreign entities being simply authorized by the president. No oversight, either by Congress or the courts. So after a particular episode over that, I went to see Senator Warren Rudman, Congressman, and Senator Joe Biden, and together they drafted what became Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act to provide a judicial oversight. What I didn't have the vision to consider in 1978 was the explosion of the digital revolution. The good old happy days of 78, get the court established, the court gives a warrant to collect all of X country's traffic. You go down to the dedicated line, put on the recorders. The only thing you ever heard about U.S. citizens was if the embassy was talking about it. Suddenly, packet switching. No more dedicated lines. You had to search through a vast volume just to find the traffic you were authorized to collect. So then it became, how did you suppress all of that about U.S. citizens? And that whole series of rules and regulations were put in place that, again, the congressional committees oversaw. This other part, I never contemplated in 78. People coming into the country on legitimate travel visas and then going to flight schools to learn to fly multi-engine aircraft and organizing and flying hijacking and flying planes into buildings. they operated as individuals. They weren't there as representatives of a country or a trade organization that the legislation was to cover. So look now at Snowden et al. There is not one instance of violation of law involved. You have to go to the Wall Street Journal or to listen to Senator Feinstein, Congressman Mike Rogers, to in fact be reinforced to that there's not a single episode of violation of law.
That Snowden has revealed.
Of any of the activities of NSA
Okay,
revealed
yeah.
by Snowden. The issue, though, is, well, it may be within the law, but is it smart? Is it a practice? The one that's held up so often is listening to Chancellor Merkel's cell phone. But I noted it said beginning in 2002. 2002, she wasn't even a functionary in the party. But who was the chancellor? It was Gerhard Schroeder, who was running for re-election, playing the anti-US card, which helped him narrowly win re-election, and talking every day to Jacques Chirac, president of France, most anti-US French leader, except maybe de Gaulle, in history. And would you want to know what they were talking about? Particularly when you got the UN votes in Iraq, the answer is yes. NSA does not decide what to collect. Director Central Intelligence earlier, Director of National Intelligence, collects from all of the departments, what do you want to know? And what's the priority of what you want to know? NSA decides how to collect it in the process. If they were listening to leadership communications, you can be damn sure it was because senior people in the government wanted to know what was going on. You've not seen anyone except Dianne Feinstein and Mike Rogers stand up and defend what they were doing. So what the new Mike Rogers, who will be up for confirmation hearings on next week or two, and to take over in March as the director of NSA and the commander of the Cyber Command. He's going to have a lot of being beaten around the head and shoulders publicly. Some of these are old grudges. Pat Leahy objected to the FISA bill when it was enacted.
Back in '78?
Yeah.
This
He
is
was
the
a very
senator from Vermont, so.
Yeah, very junior
That's an
senator
old
at
grudge,
that point.
yeah.
Well, he's carried that grudge that he lost all the way through. Now he's chairman of the judiciary, and this is his chance. He's not willing to go look at what's actually been accomplished through the years. He just objected to the principle of doing it at the outset. Ron Wyden, the other most articulate, vocal, and most frequently heard critic, wanted to put all kinds of constraints on it. Running for re-election in Oregon. This plays very well to his constituent in Oregon. So politics, domestic politics, are driving popularity of the president, are driving the reaction to it, not national security concerns. Going all the way back to the public cryptography issues, we did a whole process of, I went out to University of California, Berkeley, because my general counsel, as an undergraduate, had been editor of the Daily Californian, so that gave him plenty of liberal credentials. It was the dialogue of the deaf until the Vice Chancellor, Mike Heyman, stopped and said, well, what if the evidence valid about national security concerns? And out of it came a proposal from the faculty that put together a process where if you're doing cryptographic research, you provide it to NSA, they have 60 days. Either object or you publish. If they object, they have to be willing to clear you to show you why it's clear. Key factor to sell that, I went to Stanford The principal spokesman was a professor named Marty Hellman. I step off the plane this afternoon and start off, and they're waiting to catch the flight back from Austin, was Marty Hellman. And we walked talking about the question you just asked. And his view is that the public wants it both ways. They want to be absolutely secure against terrorist attacks, and they don't want to have any invasion of their privacy, and you can't have both. And so the issue is, where do you find the balance?
Keep us safe and keep us free.